When any two states go to war, then automatically the law of neutrality springs into existence for the entire rest of the world, automatically by operation of law. So that a huge number of states then become subject to the duties of neutrals. And the legal duties are basically abstention and impartiality, those two broad categories of duties. And those became ever more detailed in the course of the 19th century and ever more demanding, so that there was, in a sense, a huge amount of practice, necessarily because of the huge number of states that automatically became neutrals, whether they liked it or not.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today it is my special pleasure to introduce to you a man I consider the world's greatest living expert on the law and history of neutrality. Dr. Stephen Neff is Professor of War and Peace at the Law School of Edinburgh University. He's a highly accomplished scholar in international law. Among his many publications are books like Hugo Grotius on the Law of War and Peace, War and the Law of Nations, Justice Among Nations, a History of International Law, and last but not least, The Rights and Duties of Neutrals, a General History. Steve also wrote a short, but to me highly enlightening and important chapter for a book I edited 4 years ago. The title of his essay there is A Tale of Two Strategies, Permanent Neutrality and Collective Security, in which he argues that neutral countries are actually a rival concept to the all-for-one, one-for-all approach of collective security to bring about peace in the international system. This and the state of neutrality in the era of the Ukraine war and the ongoing genocide in Palestine is what we want to discuss today. So welcome, Steve, and thank you very much for coming online.
Yes, thank you. And do you have some specific things that you would like to ask me or to talk about now?
Yes, exactly. I would like to start in this first segment to talk to you about your analysis of neutrality as this alternative approach to collective security. Could you maybe explain your argument in that essay with some of the examples that you're giving? Why is it that neutrality can be looked at as a counter concept to collective security?
Yes, that's right. Collective security and neutrality are, in a sense, opposite ways of getting at the problem of armed conflict in the world and promotion of peace. And as you put it, the all-for-one and one-for-all approach is the collective security approach. And that's a centralist approach, and I call it the top-down approach, because it sort of gathers the world into a single government or a single global alliance. And the idea is that that global alliance will then enforce peace by defeating aggressors. That any aggressor will not be able to succeed because the act of aggression triggers action by the entire world, and the entire world will defeat a single aggressor, however powerful. So the aggressor might be much more powerful than the victim state, perhaps Russia much more powerful than Ukraine, for example, but Russia is not more powerful than the rest of the world at large. And in order for that to work, however, there does have to be a kind of governing mechanism, some way of gathering everybody together. And also it does entail expanding conflict rather than restricting it, so that when a conflict breaks out, it's not just two countries involved, the attacker and the defender. It is the whole world that becomes involved, so that everybody's business becomes everybody else's business. And neutrality is sort of the complete opposite of that. Neutrality means standing aloof, holding back, not getting involved. And the idea there is that somebody, in a way, neutrality then is, from the collective security standpoint, bad citizenship. It's shirking one's duties to the world at large. It's failing to support victims against aggressors. It's hanging back and not doing one's proper duty. And one may say, well, what if everybody did that? Then aggressors would be able to pick off victim states one by one. But I suppose the answer to that is, well, if everybody were neutral, then there wouldn't be any wars to begin with, would there? That the idea is that behind neutrality is that conflict should be isolated and contained, whereas the collective security view is that conflict should be, in effect, expanded so as to cover the world at large. So that's the sense in which these are two actually diametrically opposed strategies for approaching the problem of world peace in general.
They also belong to two different paradigms of international relations, don't they? Like the way that we organize the international world, whereas the 19th century was organized around the paradigm of more or less Clausewitz. The post-First World War world is ordered around the paradigm of the League of Nations or the United Nations and the top-down approach to bringing peace. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, that's right. And the neutrality approach to peace does have a basic 19th century flavor to it. It is what international relations or international law scholars call a positivistic approach. They see the nations of the world as being isolated, separate units. And we see this in international law, where the fundamental principle, the cornerstone, is the sovereign equality of states and the duty of non-intervention and self-determination. Each state is on its own. Each state is entitled to develop as it wishes, to govern itself as it wishes, and states are regarded as rigorously independent and separate entities. And international law imposes, to some extent, a normative structure over that, but that's only through the will of the states. The state is the fundamental unit of international relations, and this is in keeping with the realist school of thought in international relations. And in international law, we call it the positivist school of thought. But it's the stress on independence of states and the isolation of states from one another. The 20th and 21st century paradigms, as you say, are quite different from the League of Nations and the United Nations, and that entails gathering all of the states into a single collectivity so that there is something actually like an international community. It is not that the international community is a single society in some sense of the word, at least. It is not just a collection or aggregation of entirely separate and independent units. And so so this picture is of stresses the interdependence of states on one another rather than independence of states from one another. So that you see that these two approaches reflect sort of a deeper view about what the nature of the international community actually is, whether it is an aggregation of separate units on the one hand, or whether it is something like a true community on the other.
And if you look now at the history of the development of the concept of neutrality itself, it flourished, or it developed under both paradigms, actually, right? I mean, intuitively, I would think that only the 19th century paradigm of all states are on their own, and within that world, you have certain states that choose to stay outside of the conflicts of others. That only under that paradigm, neutrality and neutrality law would develop a lot. And I think, I mean, the neutrality law we have today, especially of the Hague Conventions, the positive law, actually goes back to this paradigm. But even in the 20th century, it still continued developing, especially the customary in international law on how neutral states then behave, or what their rights and duties are. How do you see this what is a fruitful environment for neutrals to prosper in, or to add to a peaceful world.
And I would say that in the 20th and 21st centuries, it's really a matter of neutrality law surviving rather than thriving. And because it is basically incompatible with the collective security outlook, as I have said before. And in the early days of the League of Nations, there were some 𝗡𝗲𝘂𝘁𝘁, a noted scholar and foreign minister of Greece at the time, was very emphatic that that neutrality is obsolete. It is outright incompatible with the world we have, and it is dead, and that's a good thing. Now, what has happened is that neutrality against those odds has survived because the collective security vision has not really been effective, except on a couple of spectacular occasions. But by and large, neutrality continues to survive and even to flourish to the extent that the collective security vision has faltered. And even in the UN period, and even in also the League of Nations period to a lesser extent, sometimes the neutrality approach has been taken. And you see it most concretely, and we may talk about this later in the talk, so I'll just mention it quickly now. Where you would see it is in the imposition of arms embargoes, for example, against states which are in conflict, and that there may be embargoes against both parties. In other words, urging the world to hold back, so that even if a UN force isn't formed and doesn't go to the rescue of a victim, sometimes that the neutrality approach is taken instead. So neutrality has survived. It is a very tough and resilient system, and the world has been found to have an actual need for it. And we can see this in historical perspective, because if you go back to the Middle Ages and look at the period where just war theory flourished, just war theory in a way had a collective security mentality behind it. That is, that states in general were under an obligation not to assist an aggressor state, not so much to plunge in or form a multilateral force, but to not assist an aggressor state and to help out the victim. So that a very dim view of neutrality was taken. And when Hugo Grotius came writing in the 17th century, the one and only area in which he used contemporary examples for his points was neutrality, because that was the one area where he couldn't find any significant historical or classical precedents for it. And so neutrality grew from the bottom up, as it were, and really came into its own in the positivist era of the 19th century. That was the time when the just war theory and similar doctrines were discarded, and when the full dogma of independence of states came to be insisted upon and placed at the center of international law. That is when neutrality flourished at its greatest. And even now, I would say that the very greatest treatise on neutrality is by Richard Klein, the Swedish writer at the very end of the 19th century, summing up the vast amount of practice that had arisen then. And so that was the great age of neutrality. Neutrality nowadays in the collective security era is considered to be something of an embarrassment, something that will be tolerated, perhaps even made use of, but basically it is something to be tolerated rather than actually promoted. It's something which survives in the holes and corners and nooks and crannies of our legal system. Fortunately, or unfortunately, as the case may be, the holes and the nooks and the crannies are very, very large indeed, because the collective security system is highly ineffective in reality.
Yeah, I keep saying to my students, the reality of war breeds the reality of neutrality. And the fact that we never got rid of the war means you always have something to be neutral toward. But, it is from you that 4 years ago at this conference that I learned when you said that the study of international law to you is the study of learning how order emerges from chaos. Those are your words, and you then describe how especially neutrality law is a highly detailed part of that order within the chaos. Could you explain why that is? Why is it that neutrality law of all parts of international law is actually quite detailed?
Yes, it is quite detailed, and perhaps the most detailed part of all of international law. And that is because there was so much practice on it in the course of the 19th century. And that's when case law arose. And when you think that neutrality applies worldwide, if you have an armed conflict between two states, then they have to abide by the law of armed conflict itself. But when any two states go to war, then automatically the law of neutrality springs into existence for the entire rest of the world, automatically by operation of law. So that a huge number of states then become subject to the duties of neutrals. And the legal duties are basically abstention and impartiality, those two broad categories of duties. And those became ever more detailed in the course of the 19th century and ever more demanding, so that there was, in a sense, a huge amount of practice, necessarily because of the huge number of states that automatically became neutrals, whether they liked it or not. And that was one thing that bothered people, that states, by going to war, would subject all the other states of the world to the strictures of the law of neutrality without their having any say in the matter.
But
And
but the strictures of the law of neutrality are actually quite beneficial to the neutrals, aren't they? I mean, there's a lot of rights that neutrals get, and that are usually trampled on quite badly by the belligerents. So wouldn't even today shouldn't there be an interest in states to actually reinforce these rights, the right to trade with all the warfaring parties, for instance?
yes, there is the right to trade with both parties, although that's restricted also. Trade in contraband of war is not uh, allowed. Also, violations of blockade are not allowed. But also, there are other categories of things too, such as unneutral service, as it is called. Even the provision of routine services to the belligerents can fall foul of the principle of the duty of abstention. And the duties of abstention and impartiality became more strict, particularly noticeably during the American Civil War, when in the arbitration afterwards between the US and Britain, it was established that neutral states actually have a rather significant duty to police what is going on in their own countries, to make sure that even private parties are not lending support to one side and the other. And it's that duty of policing or self-policing that became more intense in the course of the 19th century and early 20th century. And then there came to be rights on the part of belligerent states to destroy or sink neutral ships sometimes, rather than simply taking them into prize courts. And so the duties involved on neutrals did come to be rather serious, although of course there were rights attached as well. But there was the asymmetry too, that the neutrals couldn't feasibly do very much to protect their rights. They could engage in resort to reprisals if their rights were trampled upon, but then they would risk being sucked into the war, as the United States was into the First World War, in attempting to stand up for its rights. And so, and the belligerents are already at war, so they have comparatively little to lose by pushing and eating away at the rights of neutrals. And so the neutral, there was a tendency for the neutrals to be squeezed at the expense of the belligerents. And you saw in the Spanish Civil War as a good example, though that wasn't quite neutrality, properly speaking, because it was a civil conflict, but it was treated effectively as if it were an international conflict. And there too, there was to be rigorous self-policing by the non-intervention states, as they called themselves. But that caused many problems, much controversy on the home fronts of countries, and there were many violations. I won't go into the details of that, but it's a good example of how difficult it is to really stay within the bounds of the law of neutrality.
Now, if we look at that law of neutrality, and as you said, it more survived rather than thrived in the 20th century, what are the aspects of modern neutrality law that were actually added, or that you can think of that are important precedents of the 20th century? And I mean, maybe on the one hand, the actual treaty negotiations, but on the other hand, also new practices that we saw emerging. Most importantly, during the Cold War, the non-aligned movement. Did the non-aligned movement and how they conducted their kind of being neither of two sides, did that actually flow into international law, or is that completely separate even today?
I would say it's completely separate, that the non-aligned movement did not make any contribution to the law of neutrality as such. It was a political movement for hanging back and not joining either of the contending camps. But neutrality really does come into its own when there is actual shooting war in progress. And so the conflict since World War II, where neutrality has played the largest role, has been in the Iran-Iraq conflict of the 1980s. And we may talk about this later on, but it's one of the somewhat surprising things that neutrality is not, at least as of yet, played a large role in the Ukraine and Russia conflict. But that may change.